My son stood in my living room with a document in his hand and pity on his face, and he said the words that were meant to finish me. "You can't even remember which patients you operated on, Mom. You think anyone will believe a confused old woman over a notarized legal document?" He said it in front of 4 people. His wife Selena, who was studying the tiled floor as if she had never seen it before. 2 neighbors from down the lane who had come by to return a pot of rice I had lent them last Tuesday, and old Mrs. Bowie from the house across the street, who had known me since I still wore my hair dark, who had stood at my husband's funeral and held my hand while the incense burned down to nothing. They all heard it. I smiled. Not the polite smile I used to give difficult family members in the surgical ward, the one that meant, "I understand your fear and I forgive your rudeness." This was quieter than that. This smile came from somewhere lower, somewhere still. The way water sits at the bottom of a deep well, undisturbed by whatever happens on the surface. Nobody in that room understood why I was smiling. I could see it in Mrs. Bowie's eyes, the quick flicker of confusion, almost concern. Selena finally looked up from the floor. Vincent, my son, my only child, the boy I had carried home from the hospital 38 years ago, wrapped in a yellow blanket. Vincent searched my face for the reaction he had prepared himself for. Anger, tears, the trembling protest of an old woman who had been outmaneuvered. He found none of those things. I set my tea glass down on the altar table, gently, so as not to disturb the offering bowl beside my husband Kian's photograph. The incense had burned low. The smoke moved in a thin, patient line toward the ceiling. "Thank you for coming by, Vincent," I said. That was all. He left 20 minutes later with Selena close behind him, the document still in his hand, and something uncertain replacing the confidence he had walked in with. The neighbors left shortly after, murmuring polite goodbyes. Mrs. Bowie stayed a moment longer at the door. She looked at me the way people look at someone who has just said something in a language they do not quite speak. "Margaret," she said softly, "are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," I told her. "Go home and rest, Sister Bowie. It's getting dark." She went. I closed the door. And then I stood alone in the house where I was born. To understand what happened in that room, you would need to understand what this house is. Not the walls, not the roof, not the market value that Vincent had apparently already calculated down to the last digit. I mean what it is to me, what it has always been since before I was old enough to understand the word inheritance. My parents built this house in 1971, the year before I came into the world. My father mixed the cement himself on a Saturday morning while my mother held the measuring line. I have heard that story so many times I can see it clearly, even though I was not yet born. My father in his white undershirt, sweat on his forehead, laughing at something my mother said, neither of them knowing yet that their daughter would grow up in these rooms, would study anatomy textbooks under the lamp in the corner bedroom, would come home to this address. After 35 years of surgical wards and 12-hour shifts, and the particular weight that settles in your hands when you have spent a day holding someone else's life steady, I became a surgical nurse in 1978. I worked until I was 64. In 35 years, I assisted in over 4,000 procedures. I learned early that the operating room does not tolerate imprecision. A misread instrument tray, a misheard instruction, a signature on the wrong line, any one of those things could end badly. You learn to be exact, or you learn to do something else. I was exact. My signature, the one I put on every patient intake form, every post-operative record, every shift handover document for 35 years, was consistent down to the millimeter. The particular pressure I applied to the pen, the way my capital M opened wide at the top and closed firm at the base, the long, clean pull of the L at the end of Lou. A handwriting analyst once told me, during a hospital training on medical record authentication, that a person's clinical signature becomes essentially unforgeable after a decade of daily practice. The muscle memory embeds itself too deep. You cannot convincingly imitate what has been written 10,000 times. I remembered that fact when I read the deed transfer document Vincent had shown me. I had read it carefully while he stood there explaining, in the tone one uses with children and elderly people, that this was simply a practical arrangement, that managing property was complicated at my age, that he was doing this for me, to help me, because he worried. I read it carefully and I saw the signature at the bottom of page 3. It had my name. It had the correct date. It had a notary seal beside it, official looking, stamped in blue. But the signature was not mine. The M opened differently. The pull of the final L was short, slightly upward, the way a right hand moves when it is copying something it has studied but not lived. Whoever had signed that document had looked at my signature and tried to reproduce it. They had done a reasonable job. Reasonable enough to fool a clerk at the housing office. Reasonable enough to fool a banker reviewing a loan application. Not reasonable enough to fool the woman who had written her name on surgical records every single day for 35 years. I set the document down on the altar table. I picked up my tea. I smiled at my son. The old people in this country say that still water runs deepest. They say it about rivers that look calm on the surface and move with tremendous force below, carrying everything along with them quietly, without announcement, without the noise that draws attention before the moment is right. I had spent 69 years becoming still water. Vincent thought he was looking at a slow, forgetful old woman who could be managed with paperwork and a notary seal. He was looking at 35 years of exact signatures. He just didn't know it yet. Kian died on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 years ago, while I was making soup in the kitchen. He had been sitting in the chair by the window, the low wooden chair with the woven seat that he had owned since before we were married, the one he refused to let me replace, no matter how many times I pointed out that the legs were uneven. He liked that chair. He said it fit the shape of him. I was cutting lemongrass at the counter, listening to him read the newspaper out loud, the way he always did, not because I asked him to, but because he liked the sound of his own voice, and I had long ago decided that I liked it too. He read me a story about a bridge being built in the north. He said the name of the bridge. Then he stopped. I waited for him to continue. The soup was simmering. The lemongrass was clean and fragrant under my knife. The silence lasted 3 seconds too long. I turned around. That is the image I carry. That kitchen doorway. The morning light coming through the window behind him. The way he was sitting still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. I crossed the room in 4 steps. I had worked in surgical wards for 35 years, and I knew before I reached him. I knew before I touched his face. Some things you cannot unknow. Kian had been a quiet man. Not shy, not cold quiet in the way that certain people are quiet, as if they have decided that the world already contains enough noise, and they will not add to it unnecessarily. He taught mathematics at the secondary school 3 streets over for 31 years. His students called him professor, even though that was not technically his title, because he carried himself in a way that made the word feel correct. He wore the same 4 shirts on rotation. He kept his desk immaculate. He could calculate the tip at a restaurant in his head before the bill arrived, and he was always exactly right. He was also the only person I have ever met who made me feel that being quiet was something to be proud of. Most of my life, people had interpreted my quietness as coldness, or distance, or particularly as I got older as evidence that I was slow to understand. Colleagues who did not know me well would sometimes speak louder when addressing me. The way people do when they assume comprehension is the problem. It was never the problem. I understood everything perfectly the first time. I simply saw no reason to respond until I had something worth saying. Kian understood this about me within the first month of our acquaintance. We had been introduced through a mutual friend at a teacher's gathering. I was a young nurse then, still in my 20s, still wearing my hair long, and he had watched me sit through an entire evening of conversation, contributing perhaps 6 sentences, and at the end of the night he had said, "You are very good at listening," not as a compliment, as an observation, the way he might note that a particular triangle had specific angle measurements, simply accurate. I decided I would marry him approximately 4 months later. We were not a dramatic couple. We did not have the kind of love that announces itself. We had 31 years of Tuesday morning soups and newspapers read aloud. We had a garden in the back of the house that Kian tended on weekend mornings while I reviewed medical journals inside. We had 1 son, born in 1986, whom we named Vincent, because Kian had a fondness for Western names and thought this one sounded steady. We had the house my parents had built, which we moved into after my mother passed and which we slowly, room by room, made into something that held both families at once. The altar in the main room holds 4 photographs now: my father, my mother, Kian's mother, who died before I met him, and Kian himself. In the photograph from the school's anniversary celebration, The one where he is almost smiling, not quite. Because Kian found full smiles somewhat theatrical, but close enough that you can see the warmth underneath. I light incense every morning. I have not missed a single morning in 7 years. This house has a sound in the early morning that I do not think I could describe to someone who had not grown up inside old walls. The wood speaks as the temperature changes, small creaks and settlings, like a body adjusting in its sleep. The roof tiles shift in the wind. The gate at the front has a particular complaint when the latch catches a short, two-tone sound that I have heard so many times it has become indistinguishable from silence, noticed only when it is absent. I know every corner of this house, the way I know the layout of a surgical tray, from memory. In the dark, if necessary. After Kian died, Vincent came to stay for 2 weeks. He was 31 then, already running the hardware supply business he had started with a loan I helped him secure by using my pension as collateral. He was attentive during those 2 weeks. He made sure I ate. He handled the paperwork, the death certificate, the utility transfers, the small bureaucratic machinery that clicks into motion after a person leaves the world. I was grateful. I told him so. "This house needs someone to look after it, Mom," he said, near the end of that first week. He was standing in the main room, looking at the walls, and something in the way he looked made me think he was not seeing the altar or the old wooden beams or the garden beyond the back window. He was seeing something else entirely. "I look after it," I said. He smiled. "Of course you do." I filed that moment away without quite knowing why. The way you file things in a surgical ward, not because they are immediately significant, but because experience has taught you that details have a way of becoming relevant later. That was 6 years before he walked into my living room with a document in his hand and pity on his face. 6 years is a long time to plan something. Or perhaps it is not long at all, perhaps it is exactly long enough to wait until grief has softened a person and made them easier to manage, until the rituals of daily life have settled into routines that make a person seem, to anyone watching from the outside, like someone who simply tends her altar and drinks her tea, and asks no questions that cannot be easily answered. I had been asking questions the entire time. I just hadn't told anyone which questions they were. The surgery was not supposed to be serious. That is what I told myself when Dr. Fuang first recommended it. Sitting across from me in his consultation room with the model of a gallbladder on his desk and the kind of measured calm that doctors practice the way musicians practice scales. Laparoscopic cholecystectomy, 4 small incisions, general anesthesia, standard procedure, very low risk. Patients typically go home within 2 to 3 days. I had assisted in this exact procedure more times than I could count. I knew the instrument names. I knew the order of the steps. I knew what the recovery felt like from the outside, the careful movements, the soft foods, the way patients winced when they laughed too soon. I was not afraid of the surgery itself. What I did not like was the anesthesia. Not the danger of it, the loss of it. 3 days in which I would not be fully present in my own life, in which the world would continue without my attention on it, in which anything could happen and I would have no knowledge of it until I woke up and asked. I had spent 35 years being the most alert person in any room I occupied. The idea of voluntary unconsciousness sat in my chest like a stone I could not shift. "Mom, it's routine," Vincent said when I told him the date. He had come for dinner that evening. Selena was traveling for work, he said, and we sat at the kitchen table the way we used to when he was young. Before the business, before the distance that had grown between us so gradually I had not been able to identify the exact year it started. "You'll go in, you'll sleep, you'll wake up and it'll be over. I'll be there when you come out. I know what the procedure involves," I said. "I know you do." He poured more tea into my cup without being asked. "I just want you to know I'll handle everything while you're recovering. The house, the utility payments, whatever needs doing. You don't have to worry about anything." I looked at him across the table. My son, 38 years old, with Kian's forehead and my mother's mouth, wearing a collared shirt that was slightly too large for him in the shoulders the way his shirts always were, because he bought them thinking he would fill them out and never quite did. He looked attentive. He looked caring. He looked like a son who loved his mother and wanted to ease her through a difficult week. I thanked him. I drank my tea. I did not tell him that I had already arranged for Mrs. Bowie to water the garden and check on the house. I did not tell him that I had reviewed every document in the house the week before: the land use certificate, my parents' original ownership papers, the transfer documentation from when the house passed to me after my mother died, and photographed each one with my phone, sending the images to a folder I kept in cloud storage under a name Vincent would not think to search. I had not done these things because I suspected him of anything specific. I had done them because I was a surgical nurse for 35 years. And in 35 years you learn that the moment before a procedure is the correct moment to verify that everything is in order. Not after. Before. I went into surgery on a Wednesday morning in October. The last thing I remember is the ceiling of the operating room, white, very clean, the overhead light a soft and even brightness, and the anesthesiologist's voice telling me to count backward from 10. I reached 7. I woke in the recovery ward to the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a monitor keeping its patient rhythm beside me, and the first thing I did, before I assessed my own pain level, before I reached for the call button, was look at the window to determine the light. Afternoon. I had been under for several hours. The procedure had gone normally. The nurse told me when she came in, everything clean, no complications, I would be able to eat soft food by evening. Vincent was there. He was sitting in the chair beside the bed with his phone in his hand, and he looked up when I opened my eyes and smiled, and it was the right kind of smile: relieved, warm, slightly tired, the way people look when they have been waiting and worrying and can finally stop. "You're back," he said. "I was always here," I said. He laughed. He brought me water. He stayed for 2 hours and then said he needed to check on the business and would come back the following morning. He kissed my forehead when he left. I cannot remember the last time he had done that. It felt, at the time, like something returning. I stayed in the hospital for 3 nights. Mrs. Bowie texted me photographs of the garden each morning. The orchids along the back wall. The pot of herbs by the kitchen step. The altar visible through the open rear door, with the incense I had prepared in advance burning low and even, everything in its place. On the 4th morning, they discharged me. Vincent drove me home. He carried my bag inside and made sure I was settled on the daybed in the main room before he left. And again the attentiveness felt genuine. And again I accepted it without comment. I was tired. The anesthesia leaves a residue in the body that takes longer to clear than the doctors suggest, a heaviness, a slight displacement, as if you have returned to your own life but are not quite fully installed in it yet. I slept most of that first afternoon. The letter arrived on the 5th day. It came in a standard envelope from the District Housing Authority, addressed to me by name, and I almost set it aside to read later because my incision sites were still tender, and bending to retrieve mail from the box at the gate had cost me more effort than I expected. But something made me open it in the garden, standing in the thin October sunlight with the orchids beside me, and the neighborhood sounds moving quietly in the background. I read it once. Then I read it again. The letter stated that the land use certificate for this address had been successfully updated to reflect the current registered owner. It listed the owner's name. The name was Vincent Liu. The effective date of transfer was the Wednesday I had gone into surgery. I stood in my garden for a long time after that, holding the letter, feeling the paper between my fingers, listening to the neighbor's radio playing something faint and indistinct 2 houses over. The orchids were doing well. Keen had planted the first one 20 years ago, and I had added to them slowly over the years until there were 11 pots along the back wall. He would have said something precise and understated about the situation, something that reduced it to its essential geometry. I could almost hear the shape of it. I folded the letter carefully along its original crease and took it inside. I did not call Vincent. Not yet. There are things you do before you speak. You make sure of what you know. You locate the exact nature of the problem before you say a word to anyone, because once you speak, you have revealed your position, and in a room where someone has already been moving pieces while you were unconscious, the last thing you do is show your hand before you know the count of theirs. I put the letter in the drawer beneath the altar, beside the originals of my parents' ownership papers and the photographs I had taken the week before surgery. Then I lit fresh incense, stood before Keen's photograph, and said nothing. There would be time to speak later. First, I needed to understand exactly how long this had been planned. I have a method for problems. It comes from the operating room, from 35 years of learning that panic is a luxury no one in a surgical ward can afford. When something goes wrong during a procedure and things go wrong, more often than patients are ever told, you do not react to the wrongness. You identify it, you name it precisely, you locate its boundaries, and then, only then, do you act. So that evening, after the incense had burned down and the neighborhood had gone quiet and the letter was in the drawer and my hands had stopped wanting to tremble, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I did not drink, and I applied my method. What did I know for certain? A letter from the District Housing Authority stated that the land use certificate for this house had been transferred to Vincent Liu, effective the day I went into surgery. That was what I knew. What did I not yet know? Whether the transfer had been executed with a document bearing a genuine signature or a false one, whether Vincent had found a way to use a power of attorney I had never granted, or whether someone had simply put my name on a line and pressed a seal beside it and hoped no one would look closely, whether this was a mistake, bureaucratic, procedural, the kind of clerical error that occasionally moved property titles around in ways that required months of correction, or whether it was not a mistake at all. I needed the document itself. The following morning I dressed carefully, the way I used to dress for important consultations at the hospital. Simply, neatly, nothing that would distract attention from my face. I chose a plain gray blouse. I put my hair up. I walked to the District Housing Authority office on the main road, moving slowly because my incision sites still reminded me of themselves on the stairs, and I arrived when the office opened at 7:30. The clerk at the front window was a young man, perhaps 25, with the particular wary politeness of someone who has learned that morning visitors often carry complaints. I received a notification about a land use certificate update for my property, I said, and gave him the address. I would like to see the transfer documentation. He typed something, looked at the screen, typed again. The certificate for that address was updated 12 days ago, he said. Registered owner is now Lou Van Vincent. I am the previous registered owner, I said. Margaret Lou. I would like to see the document that authorized the transfer. The signature page, specifically. He hesitated not because he intended to refuse, I thought, but because the request was specific enough to require him to think about it. He excused himself. He came back 10 minutes later with a photocopy of the transfer application, stapled at the corner, and slid it through the window gap. I took it to the row of chairs against the far wall and sat down and read it. The application was 3 pages. Standard form, standard language, the kind of document I had seen versions of at the hospital, bureaucratic in its precision, structured to leave no ambiguity about what was being claimed and who was claiming it. The transferring party was listed as Margaret Liu. The receiving party was Lou Van Vincent. The reason given was voluntary transfer to family member. At the bottom of page 2 was the signature. It had my name. I looked at it for a long time, long enough that the young clerk at the front window glanced over twice, uncertain whether to approach. The signature had my name, but it did not have my hand. In 35 years of signing my name to medical documents, I developed certain habits so deeply embedded they became involuntary. The way my pen lifts slightly after the first loop of the M, creating a hair-thin gap that is visible only under close examination. The way the final U of Lou trails to the right at a precise angle, not quite horizontal, not quite diagonal, a specific degree that I could not have named, but that my hand produced the same way every single time because it had done so 10,000 times before. The weight I applied firm at the downstrokes, lighter at the connectors, which left a pattern of ink distribution that was consistent across every document I had ever signed. The signature on page 2 of that transfer application did not have the gap after the M. The final U trailed upward instead of rightward. The ink distribution was even throughout, the way it looks when someone is being careful, when someone is thinking about each stroke rather than producing it from muscle memory. Someone had studied my signature and copied it. They had done it well enough to pass a housing authority clerk's review. They had done it well enough to pass whatever notary had pressed a seal beside it, and I noted the notary seal. Circular, blue ink, a name printed in small letters around the perimeter that I could not read clearly on the photocopy. They had not done it well enough to pass me. I folded the photocopy along its staple edge and placed it in my bag beside the original letter. I thanked the young clerk on my way out. He nodded with the relieved expression of someone who has not been yelled at. Outside, the morning was fully established motorcycle sounds, the smell of pho from the shop 2 doors down, a woman across the road hanging laundry on a line strung between her gateposts. Ordinary, continuous, the world proceeding as the world does, indifferent to the specific shape of any individual problem. I walked home slowly, thinking about the notary seal. A notary seal meant that someone with official credentials had certified my signature as genuine. Either that person had been deceived, had compared the false signature to some document I was not aware of, or that person had not been deceived at all, had known exactly what they were certifying, and had certified it anyway. Those were two very different situations requiring two very different responses. When I reached home, I went directly to the altar, not out of ritual but out of need, the need to stand in front of Kian's photograph and think in a space that was still entirely mine, that had not yet been touched by whatever was being built around me. The incense from the morning had burned to ash. I did not light new sticks. I simply stood. I took out my phone and photographed the transfer document, all 3 pages, in clear light. Then I opened the photographs I had taken the week before my surgery, the originals, my parents' papers, my own records. And I looked at something I had noticed before but not yet named. In the stack of documents I had photographed, there was one page I did not recognize. I had assumed, when I first sorted through the papers, that it was an old receipt or a superseded form that my mother had stored with the land documents decades ago. I had photographed it without examining it closely because I was working quickly that evening, and it had appeared blank at first glance, a standard form, unused, filed away with the others for reasons I had not questioned. I opened that photograph now and enlarged it. It was not blank. There was a date at the top of the form, recent, and at the bottom, in the space marked authorized representative, there was a name I recognized, a notary named Derek Pham. I sat down on the daybed and looked at the name on my phone screen and felt the particular quality of stillness that comes not from calm but from the sudden, complete understanding of how large a thing actually is. The form was a draft. Someone had been practicing. Derek Pham. I sat with that name for the rest of the morning, turning it the way you turn a difficult instrument in your hand before using it, making sure you understand its weight and angle before you commit to the motion. I did not know Derek Pham personally. The name meant nothing to me from my years at the hospital, nothing from the neighborhood, nothing from any context I could locate in my memory. He was simply a name on a draft form that had been filed with my parents' land documents filed there deliberately. I now understood. The way you file a rehearsal copy somewhere, it will not be immediately noticed. Somewhere it will look like clutter. Somewhere an old woman tidying her papers might glance at it and set it aside without reading it closely. I was not that old woman, but I had almost been. I searched his name that afternoon on my phone, slowly, because I was still not entirely comfortable with the speed at which information moved on these small screens. I had learned to use them out of necessity rather than interest, the way I had learned to use several things in my life. I searched Derek Pham, notary, and added the name of the district, and then I sat in the kitchen light reading what came back. What came back was not what I expected. Derek Pham had held a notary certification for 11 years. He had operated an office on a commercial street not far from the hardware district where Vincent's shop was located. His name appeared on business registration documents, property transfers, loan applications, the ordinary paperwork of an ordinary notary's practice. His certification had been suspended 2 years ago. The suspension notice, which had been published in the Provincial Official Gazette and which I found after 20 minutes of searching through government announcement archives, was brief and administrative in its language. Derek Pham's notary certification had been suspended pending investigation into irregularities in documentation he had certified on behalf of third parties. The investigation was described as ongoing. There was no follow-up notice that I could find indicating the investigation had been resolved. A suspended notary. I set the phone down on the table and looked at the wall. The seal on my transfer document, the blue circular seal beside the signature that was not mine, had been pressed by a man who had no legal authority to press it, who had not had that authority for 2 years, which meant that not only was the signature on that document false, the certification of that signature was also false. 2 layers of fraud. One sitting on top of the other. Each one necessary to make the other appear legitimate. This was not a mistake. This was not a clerical error that could be explained by a distracted housing authority clerk or a misunderstood instruction. This was constructed, deliberately, carefully, with knowledge of how official processes worked and what gaps existed within them. I thought about Vincent standing in this kitchen 2 months before my surgery, pouring tea into my cup, telling me he would handle everything while I recovered. I thought about how long 2 months was. I thought about whether 2 months was when the planning had begun, or whether it was simply when I had first noticed the shape of it. I called Carol the next morning. Dr. Carol Wynn had been chief of surgery at our hospital for the last 9 years of my career there. We had worked together for longer than that. She had been a senior surgeon when I was still a mid-career nurse, and we had developed over the years the particular kind of trust that forms between people who have stood on opposite sides of the same table in difficult situations and found each other reliable. She was precise, direct, and allergic to unnecessary words. I had always respected her for all 3 qualities. She answered on the second ring. "Margaret," she said. "How is the recovery?" "Good," I said. "I need to ask you something. Are you still on the hospital's document authentication committee?" A brief pause. "I am. Why?" I told her what I had found. Not everything. I was not ready to say everything out loud yet, because saying things out loud makes them real in a different way, and I was still arranging the pieces into an order I could stand behind. But I told her about the signature. I described what I had observed about it, the specific differences from my own hand, and I asked her what she thought the most reliable comparison documents would be. "Your surgical records," she said immediately. 35 years of daily signatures. If you want to establish what your authentic signature looks like, there is no better evidence in existence. She paused again. "Margaret, are you telling me someone forged your signature on a property document?" "I am telling you I would like to be certain before I say that to anyone officially." She understood. She said she would pull a representative sample of my old records from the hospital archive, and that we would meet when I was ready. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat for a moment in the quiet of the main room. The afternoon light was moving across the altar, crossing Kian's photograph at an angle that made the glass reflect white, obscuring his face briefly before the light shifted again. I opened my phone and found the real estate loan application websites. I had been thinking about Derek Pham's suspended certification. I had been thinking about the loan application forms that appeared in the list of documents he had certified before his suspension. I had been thinking about what a man needs a fraudulent notary for. Specifically, if he already has a fraudulently transferred land use certificate, he needs it to borrow against the property. It took me 40 minutes of searching through the online portal of the district's commercial lending registry, a government database I had not known existed, until I found a reference to it in a legal advice column to locate what I was looking for. A loan application, filed 3 weeks after my surgery, using this address as collateral security. The borrower was listed as Vincent Liu, registered owner. The loan amount was 380 million dong. I read that number twice. Then I sat back in my chair and felt the room around me settle into a new configuration, the way a space changes when you understand what has actually been happening inside it. My house had not simply been transferred out of my name. My house had been transferred so that it could be used. Borrowed against. Leveraged into a sum of money that my son needed badly enough to forge a dying woman's signature while she was sedated in a hospital room, to hire a man with a suspended certification and press an illegal seal onto a false document, to file the papers on the exact day I could not be present to notice or object. 380 million dong. And the loan had already been approved. I looked at the approval date on my screen, looked at the repayment schedule, looked at the column on the right side of the document that I had almost missed, the one that listed the collateral forfeiture conditions, the circumstances under which the lending institution was entitled to seize the secured property if payments were not maintained. Vincent's last 3 monthly payments were marked in red. He had already stopped paying. I did not sleep well that night, but not for the reasons people might assume. It was not grief that kept me awake. It was not anger, though anger was present, quiet and banked like coals that have been burning long enough to need no tending. What kept me awake was the specific, technical problem of sequencing. In the operating room, when a situation becomes complicated, the question is never simply, what do I do? The question is always, what do I do first? And then second, and in what order do these steps need to occur so that each one is possible because of the one before it? I lay in the dark and I sequenced. First, the signature comparison. Before I said a single word to any official, before I filed any complaint or made any accusation, I needed the comparison to be done properly by someone with professional standing who could say what she had observed and be believed. Carol was the right person for this. She had credentials. She had 30 years of experience with authenticated medical documentation, and she had known my handwriting for as long as I had known hers. Second, the notary. Derek Phamb's suspension needed to be verified through official channels, not only through my phone search. The Provincial Gazette entry was public record, but I needed a clean copy with a reference number, the kind of document that could be presented to an investigator without question. Third, the loan. I needed the full loan documentation, not just the approval summary I had found in the lending registry. The terms, the collateral agreement, the forfeiture schedule. I needed to understand exactly how far along the process was before the bank would move to seize the property. Fourth, and most carefully, I needed to do all of this without Vincent knowing I was doing it. This was the constraint that shaped everything else. The moment Vincent understood that I had found the loan, that I had examined the transfer document closely enough to see its false signature, that I knew Derek Phamb's name, the moment he understood any of that, he would move. Into what kind of action I could not be certain, but I had spent 6 years noticing the way Vincent thought, and I knew that his first instinct when cornered was to talk his way out, and his second instinct was to make the person cornering him look like the problem. I needed everything in order before he had a reason to start talking. I began the following Monday, when my incision sites had settled enough that I could move without the discomfort announcing itself at every step. I went to the provincial records office first, not the district housing authority but the provincial level, where the official Gazette archives were maintained. I told the clerk I was researching a notary certification for a property matter and needed a certified copy of any suspension notices filed in the past 3 years. This was a public records request. It took 40 minutes and a small administrative fee. I left with a clean printed copy of Derek Phamb's suspension notice, stamped and reference numbered, folded inside my bag. From there I walked to the bank. Not Vincent's lending institution, I would approach that separately, but my own bank, where I had held the same account for 21 years, where the manager knew my face and the staff knew my name. I asked to speak with the branch manager, a woman named Miss Hoa, whom I had met on 3 or 4 occasions over the years at the kind of minor community events that banks sponsor in residential neighborhoods. She received me in her office with the particular attentive courtesy that bank managers extend to long-term customers of a certain age. I told her I needed a certified copy of my signature card, the original record of the signature I had provided when I opened the account 21 years ago, and any subsequent signature updates on file. She looked at me with mild curiosity. "Is there a problem with your account, Miss Liu?" "No problem," I said. "I am involved in a property matter that requires signature verification. I need the official bank record." She produced it within 15 minutes. 3 signature cards, the original from account opening, and 2 updates, one from 7 years ago when I had briefly changed the form of my name on documents after Kian died, and one from 4 years later when I had returned to my original form. All 3 were stamped with the bank's authentication mark, date recorded, official. I held those 3 cards in my hands and looked at my own handwriting across 21 years, and I felt something settle in my chest that I recognized as certainty. The old people say that still water runs deepest. They mean it as a caution: do not mistake quietness for emptiness, do not read the surface as the whole story. But I had always understood it as something more practical than that. Still, water runs deepest because depth requires stillness. Movement at the surface disperses energy outward. It is the water that moves without disturbing the surface that travels the farthest, reaches the places no one thought to guard. I had been still for 6 years. I had been watching and filing and noticing and saying nothing. And now I was moving, and no one who was looking at my surface would have seen any difference at all. I met Carol at a faux shop near the hospital on a Thursday morning, the kind of place where the tables are close together, and the noise of the lunch crowd provides its own privacy. I brought the 3 bank signature cards in a folder. She brought a sealed envelope from the hospital records department containing 12 representative samples of my surgical signatures, pulled from patient files spanning 1985 to 2019. We ordered soup we did not particularly intend to eat, and spread the documents on the table between us. Carol examined the transfer document signature first. She did not speak for several minutes. She held it at different angles. She used the small magnifying glass she had brought without my asking, because Carol had always anticipated what a situation required. "The pressure pattern is wrong," she said finally. "Your downstrokes are heavier than your upstrokes by a consistent margin. This signature shows even pressure throughout. I noticed the trailing angle on the final U. Yes. And the gap after the first letter is absent." She set the document down and looked at me. "Margaret, this is not your signature. I know. You have known since you saw it. I have known since I saw it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents laid out between our untouched soup bowls. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be willing to say what you just said in an official setting, with your name and credentials attached to it." She did not hesitate. "Of course." I gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. We ate our soup after that, or made the motions of eating it, and talked about other things, her department, a former colleague who had retired to the coast, the orchids along my back wall that were doing particularly well this season. Normal things. The things that continue while other things are being quietly decided. I was almost home when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I did not recognize. I stopped on the pavement outside my gate and read it. The message contained 4 words and a document attachment. The 4 words were, "You should see this." The attachment, when I opened it, was a photograph of a second loan application, same lending institution, same address listed as collateral, same false signature at the bottom. A second loan, filed the week after the first one was approved, for 500 million dong. I did not reply to the unknown number. Not because I was afraid of it, but because I needed to think about it carefully before I engaged with it, and careful thinking requires time, and time was something I had been managing with the same precision I applied to everything else. I saved the photograph of the second loan application to my cloud folder. I noted the timestamp on the message. I put my phone in my pocket and went inside and made tea, and sat at the kitchen table and thought about who knew enough about this situation to send me that document, and why they had chosen this particular moment to do so. The answer I arrived at was not comfortable. Someone close to Vincent knew what he had done. Close enough to have seen the second loan application. And that person had decided, for reasons I did not yet understand, to put the information in my hands, which meant the situation had more participants than I had accounted for, and more moving pieces, and the possibility that someone else's timeline was operating alongside mine in ways I could not fully see. I did not like that, but I filed it, the way I had always filed things that I could not yet use, and I went to bed, and I slept, because clarity requires rest and I had work to do in the morning. Vincent came on a Saturday. He did not call ahead. He arrived at 9:30, when I was in the garden checking on the orchids, and I heard his car on the lane, and then heard the gate, and by the time I had come through the back door and into the main room he was already inside, which told me he had used the key I had given him 3 years ago for emergencies. The one I had not thought to ask back because it had not occurred to me that I would need to. Selena was with him. She had not come to this house in 4 months. She stood just inside the doorway looking at the room with an expression I could not read from the kitchen entrance, and when she saw me she produced a smile that engaged her mouth but nothing above it. "Mom," Vincent said. He was using the warm voice, the attentive son voice. "We wanted to come by and see how you were feeling." The recovery is fine," I said. "I didn't know you were coming. We wanted it to be a surprise." He smiled. He moved to the daybed and sat down with the ease of someone who has decided a space belongs to him. "Actually, Mom, there's something we wanted to talk about." "Sit down." I sat. Not because he told me to, but because I wanted to watch his face from a level position. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, the posture of a man having a reasonable conversation. "I've been thinking about this house, about your situation here, living alone, managing everything by yourself." He paused. "Selena and I have been talking. We think it would be better for everyone if we moved in, to help you. To make sure you're not alone." I looked at him. "The house is in my name now," he continued. And there it was, the thing underneath the careful language, surfacing cleanly. It makes sense for us to be here. We can take the main bedroom. You'd still have your room, of course, and the garden. Nothing would really change for you. Selena was looking at the altar, not at me, not at Vincent, at Kian's photograph. There was something in her expression that I examined and set aside for later. And the loan? I said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Vincent's face did not change, which told me he had prepared for this possibility and had decided which expression to wear if it arose. The loan is a business matter, he said. I'm handling it. You don't need to worry about it. A business matter secured against this house. Against my house, Mom. His voice did not harden, but the warmth in it thinned perceptibly. The way light thins in the late afternoon. Still present but carrying less. I know you received the housing authority letter. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry for that. But the transfer was straightforward. You're getting older. Managing property is complicated. I did it to protect you. You did it while I was under general anesthesia. The timing was practical. The paperwork was already prepared. He met my eyes, and for a moment I saw something underneath the rehearsed calm that I recognized. Not guilt. Something closer to impatience, the expression of a person who has decided the obstacle in front of them is smaller than it appears and is mildly annoyed that it is taking this long to move past. Mom, I think you're upset because no one explained it to you properly. That's my fault. But the reality is that this is the right arrangement, for the house, for you, for the family. And if I disagree? He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, You can't even remember which patients you operated on, Mom. You think anyone will believe a confused old woman over a notarized legal document? He said it gently. That was the thing I had not expected. Not cruelty delivered with heat, the way anger speaks, but cruelty delivered with the patient, slightly sad tone of someone explaining a difficult truth to a person who is not quite capable of grasping it. As if he were doing me a kindness by being honest. As if my confusion were already established, and this conversation were simply the process of helping me accept it. I looked at my son. I thought about a yellow blanket, a small face, 38 years of this life and that one intersecting, and all the specific moments that had accumulated between us like the growth rings inside a tree, invisible from the outside but present in every cross-section. I said nothing. Vincent took my silence for what he expected it to be. He straightened up from his forward lean and glanced at Selena, and something passed between them, a small, completed exchange, a look that said what they had come to accomplish had been accomplished. He stood. We'll come back next weekend with some boxes, he said. We'll take the main bedroom, like I said. You won't have to move much. He looked around the room once more, and I watched his eyes move across the altar, across the walls, across the windows that looked into the garden my parents had planted. And what I saw in his face was not love, and it was not even indifference, it was ownership. The way a person looks at something they have already decided is theirs, and are simply waiting for the formality of possession to catch up with the decision. I'll see you out, I said. At the door, he paused. Mom. He said it the way you say a word you are using as punctuation rather than meaning. This is better for everyone. You'll see. I closed the door behind them. I listened to the car start. I listened to it move down the lane until I could no longer hear it. They and I walked to the altar and stood before Kian's photograph and took one long breath. They were coming back next weekend. I had 7 days. And somewhere in this city, an unknown person with access to Vincent's loan documents was waiting to see what I would do next. That evening I replied to the unknown number. 2 words. I am listening. The response came within minutes, as if the person on the other end had been holding their phone, waiting. The message contained an address, a faux shop in a neighborhood I did not know well, 20 minutes from my house by motorbike taxi, and a time. Sunday morning, 8 o'clock. Then, come alone. I will explain everything. And then, after a pause that I could see in the timestamp between messages, I am sorry. I should have come sooner. I did not sleep much that night. Not from fear. From the particular weight of knowing that what I was about to learn would be heavier than what I already carried. And that once I learned it, I would not be able to set it down. The faux shop was small and uncrowded at that hour, the breakfast rush not yet fully formed. I arrived 5 minutes early, and chose a table against the wall where I could see the entrance. I ordered tea I did not intend to drink and waited. She came in at 8:02. Selena. She was wearing a plain dark jacket and no makeup, and she looked, without the careful presentation she wore when she came to my house, considerably younger and considerably more frightened. She sat across from me without greeting, and put her hands flat on the table and looked at them rather than at me. "You sent the documents," I said. "Yes." "Why?" She looked up then. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who has not slept properly in a long time, who has been carrying something that has grown too heavy to carry quietly, and has finally found the moment when it must be set down regardless of the consequences. "Because it's gone too far," she said. "I thought in the beginning, I told myself it was a loan, it was a business decision, it would be repaid and your name would go back on the certificate and you would never need to know." That's what he told me. He said it was temporary. He said he would fix it before you noticed. I looked at her hands on the table. "There are 2 loans." She closed her eyes. "Yes. Tell me about the second one." What she told me in the next 40 minutes I will not recount in its entirety, because some of it was the kind of information that belongs in legal documents and evidence files, and not in the part of the story that a person carries inside herself. But I will tell you the shape of it, because the shape is what matters. The shape is what I came home from that pho shop carrying like a weight distributed across my entire body, present in every step. Vincent's business had been failing for 3 years. Not struggling, failing. In the specific way that means the end is not a possibility but a timeline. He owed money to suppliers, to a private lender whose terms were not the kind that appear in official registries, to the tax authority for 2 years of underpaid filings. The total debt was not a number I had known. When Selena said it, I made her repeat it, not because I had misheard, but because I needed to hear it twice to believe that the number was real. 840 million dong. He had used my house, my parents' house, the house my father had built with his hands on a Saturday morning, while my mother held the measuring line he had used it to borrow against, twice, for a combined total of 880 million dong, and he had spent most of it already, and the payments had stopped, and the bank's forfeiture timeline was not months away. It was 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, if the payments were not resumed, the lending institution was entitled under the loan agreement to begin seizure proceedings against the collateral property. My house. Selena was crying by then, quietly, the way someone cries who has been doing it in private for long enough that they have learned to do it without taking up much space. She said she had not known about the false signature until after the first loan was filed. She said she had found the draft notary form by accident in the pocket of Vincent's jacket when she was taking it to be cleaned. She said she had confronted him and he had said it was the only way, that he would have explained but there wasn't time, that the important thing was to save the business and then everything would be fixed. She said she had believed him for 1 month until she saw the second application on his desk one evening when he thought she was asleep. "Why didn't you come to me then?" I asked. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because I was afraid of what it would mean. For him. For us." She looked at me across the table. "And because I was ashamed. I knew about it. I didn't stop it. That makes me part of it." I looked at this young woman who had come into my family 7 years ago, and who I had never known well, had never tried hard enough to know, I thought now, with the specific regret that comes when you understand that the distance between 2 people was maintained by both of them, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Sorrow, not for myself, for her. She had been living inside this for months, carrying it in the way that people carry things they are ashamed of, which is to say alone, and in the dark, and with no one to set any portion of it down with. "The original documents," I said, "the transfer papers, do you know where he keeps them?" "At the shop. In the safe, in the back office. He keeps everything there." She reached into her jacket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between us. "The combination." I looked at the paper. I did not touch it yet. "You understand what you are doing," I said. "Yes." "You understand what it will mean for him?" She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the street was filling with morning traffic, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Sunday accumulating like water rising. When she finally spoke, her voice was very small and very steady at the same time, the voice of someone who has finished deciding. "He signed your name," she said. "He signed your parents' names." He took the house where your husband's photograph is on the altar, and he borrowed against it like it was money he already had the right to spend. And he was going to let the bank take it, and tell you it was complicated, and that you were too old to understand. She met my eyes. He would have let them take it, Miss Liu. He had a plan for that too. He was going to tell you that you had signed the papers yourself and forgotten. I sat in that faux shop with the untouched tea in front of me and felt the full weight of that land on my chest. He was going to tell me I had signed the papers myself and forgotten. The confused old woman who couldn't remember which patients she had operated on. He had been building that story for months, laying its foundation the same way he had laid the foundation of everything else, quietly, carefully, while I was looking the other direction, the dismissiveness in his voice when he spoke to me. The slightly sad patience, the performance of a concerned son managing a mother who was no longer fully reliable. It had not been improvised. It had been prepared. I picked up the piece of paper with the safe combination and folded it once and placed it in my bag. "Thank you," I said. Selina nodded. She did not ask what I was going to do. Perhaps she already knew. Perhaps she understood, the way people sometimes understand things about other people that they cannot quite articulate, that she was sitting across from a woman who had spent 35 years in rooms where precision was the only thing standing between a person and the worst possible outcome. I left the money for both teas on the table. I walked out into the Sunday morning light, and I felt, underneath the grief, and underneath the anger, and underneath the cold, clear understanding of what I now knew, one thing more: I was ready. I had 6 days. 6 days before Vincent returned with boxes and the confident manner of a man who believed the matter was settled. 6 days to transform everything I had gathered: the documents, the certified copies, the bank signature cards, Carol's professional assessment, the combination to a safe I had not yet opened into an arrangement precise enough to be irrefutable. In the operating room, the preparation before a procedure takes longer than the procedure itself. This is something that people outside surgical work rarely understand. They imagine the surgery as the event, the central thing, the moment where skill and training are deployed. But the surgery is only possible because of everything that came before it: the verification of patient identity, the confirmation of instrument counts, the review of allergies and complications and contraindications, the precise laying out of every tool in the exact order it will be needed. You do not improvise in an operating room. You execute a plan that has already been made so thoroughly that execution becomes almost inevitable. I was in preparation. Monday I went to the shop. Not to see Vincent. He would not be there on a Monday morning, he had told me once, in the years when he still told me things about his routine, that he spent Monday mornings at the wholesale market sourcing inventory. The shop would be managed by his assistant, a young man named Hui who had worked there for 2 years and who knew me as Vincent's mother, which meant he knew me as someone unremarkable, someone who might stop by to leave something for her son or retrieve something she had left behind. I told Hui I had left my reading glasses in the back office the last time I visited. He nodded and went back to the customer he was helping without further thought, because elderly mothers who leave reading glasses in back offices are not a category of event that requires attention. The back office was small and dim, smelling of cardboard and machine oil. The safe was where Selina had described it, floor level, pushed against the wall behind the desk, partially obscured by a stack of inventory catalogs that had been placed in front of it with the casual concealment of someone who wanted it unnoticed rather than hidden. I moved the catalogs. I entered the combination. My hands were steady. The safe opened. Inside, a red folder, thick with papers. I did not read them there. I took the folder, relocked the safe, replaced the catalogs in their original position, and walked back through the shop with my bag over my shoulder and my expression entirely ordinary. "Did you find them?" Hui called from behind the counter. "Yes, thank you," I said. "Don't trouble yourself." I was on the pavement outside before my heart rate changed at all. That evening I spread the contents of the red folder across the kitchen table. The original transfer application was there, not a copy, the original, with the false signature and Derek Pham's illegitimate seal. There was also a copy of the first loan agreement, annotated in Vincent's handwriting in the margins, numbers, dates, calculations. And beneath those, the second loan agreement, and beneath that, something I had not known to look for, a third document, not a loan application, a sale listing agreement dated 5 weeks ago, with a real estate agency I did not recognize, for a property at this address, listed for sale. The seller listed as Vincent Liu. He had listed my house for sale. I sat with this for a long time. The incense on the altar had burned out, and I had not replaced it, and the room was very quiet, and outside the neighbor's dog made one short sound and then went silent, and I sat at the table where my mother had served meals for 40 years, and looked at the document that described this house as a commodity to be sold. The sale listing was contingent, the document noted, on the current occupant vacating the premises. The current occupant. That was me. That was what I had become in this arrangement. An occupant. A temporary presence in my own parents' house. In the house where Kian and I had spent 31 years. In the house where the altar stood and the orchids grew along the back wall, and the gate made its specific two-tone sound when the latch caught. An occupant to be vacated. I placed the sale listing at the top of my evidence stack, face up, so that it would be the first thing anyone saw when the folder was opened. Tuesday, I called Officer Min Tran. I had found his name through the District Housing Authority's official website, in the section listing the personnel of the investigation division. His title was Housing Fraud Investigator. I had no relationship with him, no introduction, no mutual acquaintance. I called the office number listed on the website and asked for him by name, and was transferred after a brief hold. He answered with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to receiving calls that ranged from legitimate complaints to elaborate misunderstandings. I told him I was reporting a property fraud, gave him my name and address, and told him I had documentary evidence and a professional witness available. What kind of documentary evidence? He asked. Original forged transfer documents. Certified signature comparison by a medical professional with 35 years of authenticated records for comparison. A notary seal from a certification suspended 2 years ago. 2 fraudulent loan agreements and a sale listing on property I legally own. I paused. And the signed confession of a secondary party. The line was quiet for 2 seconds. Can you come in on Thursday? He asked. Wednesday, I said. I have a deadline. He agreed to Wednesday. Wednesday morning I went to Carol. She had prepared her documentation with the thoroughness I had expected from her, a written assessment, 3 pages, signed and dated, with her full credentials listed at the top and the specific observations itemized with the precision of someone who understood that this document would be read by people who needed to be convinced rather than people who already understood. She had attached copies of 12 surgical signature samples, each one labeled with the date and patient file reference number, each one demonstrating the consistency that 35 years of daily practice produces. She handed me the envelope and looked at me across her desk. Margaret, she said. Are you all right? I considered the question properly, the way I considered all questions that deserved a proper answer. I am exactly all right, I said. She nodded. She understood what I meant. We had stood on opposite sides of difficult tables for decades, and we had learned each other's language. Wednesday afternoon I met Officer Tran. I laid the documents on his desk in the order I had decided upon. The sale listing first, the thing that showed the intention beneath everything else, the destination the entire plan had been moving toward, then the transfer application with its false signature, then the bank signature cards and Carol's assessment, then the certified copy of Derek Pham's suspension, then the 2 loan agreements, then the combination note in Selena's handwriting, which I had kept because it demonstrated her knowledge and her choice to come forward. Officer Tran did not speak while I arranged the documents. He looked at each one as I placed it, and his expression was the expression of someone performing the rapid internal calculation of a person who has received exactly what they were not expecting to receive. When I finished, he looked up at me. You assembled this yourself? He said. I had help, I said. Dr. Carol Nguyen for the signature comparison. The bank for the signature cards. The Provincial Records Office for the suspension notice. I folded my hands in my lap. The rest I assembled myself. He looked at the stack for a moment longer. Miss Liu, he said, I need to make several phone calls, and I will need you to return here on Friday with Dr. Nguyen and anyone else you consider a material witness. I will also need a representative from the lending institution present, I said. They are a victim of this fraud as well. They should know the status of their collateral before they proceed with any forfeiture actions. He looked at me with an expression I had seen before, Not quite surprise, but the adjustment a person makes when they realize they are not dealing with what they initially assumed. "I'll arrange it," he said. I thanked him and stood and gathered my bag. Outside, the afternoon was warm and ordinary, the street full of its usual sounds and movements, nothing remarkable, nothing that would tell an observer that anything was different from any other Wednesday. But Friday was coming, and everyone who needed to be in that room was going to be in that room. And everything that had been built in secret was going to be opened in the light, and the only remaining question was whether Vincent would understand what was happening before it was already finished. I walked home through the ordinary afternoon and lit fresh incense on the altar, and stood before Kian's photograph and felt, for the first time in weeks, that the weight I had been carrying had found its proper shape. It was not heavy anymore. It was simply ready. Friday arrived the way important days always arrive, without announcement, without ceremony, identical in its morning sounds to every morning before it. I woke early. I made tea. I stood at the altar and lit incense and looked at Kian's photograph for a long moment without speaking. Then I dressed carefully, the same gray blouse I had worn to the housing authority office, my hair up, the folder under my arm, the complete folder now, organized in the exact order I had established in Officer Tran's office 2 days before, each document in its position, each position chosen for a reason. I arrived at the District Housing Authority at 8:45. Officer Tran met me in the lobby and walked me to the conference room on the second floor. It was a plain room, a long table, 8 chairs, a window that looked out onto the street below where motorbikes moved in their usual morning patterns. A projector had been set up at one end of the table, connected to a laptop that a young administrative officer was adjusting when I came in. Carol was already there, seated midway down the table, her own folder in front of her, her expression calm and precise. Beside her sat a man I did not know, mid-50s, suited, with the careful posture of someone representing an institution rather than himself. The bank's representative, Officer Tran confirmed when I asked. His name was Mr. Dow. We waited. At 9:03, Vincent came in. He was alone. I had expected Selena might be with him, but he came through the door by himself. And when he saw the room, the table, the faces, Officer Tran in his official capacity at the head, Carol, the bank representative, the young officer at the projector, I watched him perform a rapid internal adjustment of the kind that people make when they understand that the situation they have walked into is not the situation they were told they were walking into. He had been told, by Officer Tran's office, that he was attending a routine verification meeting regarding a property registration query, standard language, uninformative by design. He looked at me last. I had chosen my seat with the same attention I gave to everything else directly across the table from where I knew he would sit, close enough that he would not be able to look at the documents without also being able to see my face. I wanted him to be able to see my face. "Sit down, Mr. Liu," Officer Tran said. "Thank you for coming." Vincent sat. He placed his hands on the table in front of him and looked at Officer Tran and did not look at me again, which told me he was already managing his presentation, already deciding what version of himself to be in this room. "This meeting concerns the land use certificate for the property at." Officer Tran read out my address. Specifically, a transfer of registration that was filed and processed approximately 6 weeks ago. Miss Margaret Liu has filed a formal complaint regarding that transfer. We're here to review the documentation. Vincent's voice was measured when he spoke. I don't understand the issue. The transfer was properly filed. All the paperwork was in order. That's what we're here to determine, Officer Tran said. He nodded to me. I opened the folder. The transfer application lists my signature on page 2, I said. I placed the document on the table and slid it to the center where everyone could see it. This is the original, which was in the safe at my son's shop until Monday of this week. I did not look at Vincent when I said this. I did not need to. I would like Dr. Carol Wynn to describe what she observed when she examined this signature. Carol opened her own folder. She spoke for 4 minutes, clearly and without inflection. The way she had always spoken in clinical settings, not performing certainty but simply reporting observation, which is more convincing than any performance. She described the pressure pattern, the trailing angle of the final letter, the absent gap after the initial. She described the 12 surgical signature samples she had pulled from the hospital archive, spanning 35 years. She placed 3 of them on the table beside the transfer document for direct comparison. In my professional assessment, she concluded, the signature on this transfer application was not produced by the same hand that produced these medical records. The differences are consistent, specific, and not attributable to age or variation. This signature was copied, not written. The bank representative, Mr. Dow, leaned forward slightly. He was looking at the documents on the table with the focused attention of a man doing rapid calculations about what this meant for his institution. I placed the second document on the table. The notary seal beside that signature belongs to Derek Pham. I slid the certified copy of the suspension notice across the table. Mr. Pham's notary certification was suspended 2 years ago pending investigation into documentation irregularities. He had no legal authority to certify any document at the time this transfer was filed. This is the official Provincial Gazette notice, reference numbered and certified. Silence in the room. Vincent said, I didn't know his certification had lapsed. I used him in good faith. You used him, I said, because a notary with a valid certification would have required you to present the signatory in person. I looked at my son directly for the first time since he had sat down. I was in surgery. I could not be presented in person. Mr. Pham did not require it. Mom, I am not finished. I placed the bank signature cards on the table. 3 of them, 21 years of authentic signatures, stamped and authenticated by the bank. I placed them beside Carol's surgical samples and beside the transfer document, all 3 categories of evidence in a line that anyone in the room could read. Then I placed the first loan agreement on the table, then the second, then the sale listing. I heard Vincent's breath change when the sale listing appeared. A small sound, barely audible. The sound a person makes when they see the precise boundary of how much is known. 2 loan agreements, I said, totaling 880 million dong, secured against a property that was transferred using a forged signature and an illegitimate notary seal. And a sale listing for the same property, filed 5 weeks ago, contingent on the current occupant vacating the premises. I paused. The current occupant is me, the woman whose name was forged. Mr. Dow from the bank had opened his own notebook and was writing in it with focused urgency. Vincent looked at me across the table. And what I saw in his face in that moment I will not describe in full, because some things belong only to the room they occurred in, but I will say this. The expression he had worn when he came to my house, the patient, slightly sad expression of a man explaining difficult truths to someone not fully capable of grasping them, that expression was gone. Entirely. You can't, he started. She cannot what? Carol said. And her voice carried the particular quality of a person who has spent 30 years being the final authority in the room and has not lost the habit. Provide documentation? Present evidence? Request that a fraud investigation be conducted? She looked at him across the table. She has done all 3. Officer Tran set down his pen. Mr. Liu, he said, I need to inform you that based on the documentation presented today, I am opening a formal fraud investigation. The transfer in question will be suspended pending that investigation. The property will revert to its previous registration status with immediate effect. He looked at Mr. Dow. I will also be recommending that the lending institution review the basis of both loan agreements, as the collateral used to secure them may have been fraudulently obtained. Mr. Dow nodded once, tightly. He was already closing his notebook. Vincent looked at me. I thought about what he had said in my living room, in the gentle, explanatory tone he had used as a weapon. You can't even remember which patients you operated on. A confused old woman, words designed to make me small, to make me doubt myself, to make everyone around me doubt me before I could say a single word in my own defense. I had not defended myself with words. I had defended myself with 35 years of signatures, with a stack of documents so precisely organized that the truth had not needed me to argue for it. It had simply needed to be placed on a table, in the right order, in front of the right people. I looked at my son and I said, very quietly, I remembered every patient I ever operated on. I remembered their names and their files and the specific instruments used in each procedure. I remembered everything. I gathered my folder and closed it. I also remembered my own signature. The room was very still. Outside the window, the The street continued its ordinary Friday morning. Somewhere below, a vendor called out prices. A motorbike horn sounded once and faded. I folded my hands on the table and waited for what came next. Vincent did not leave the building immediately. I had expected him to. I had expected the meeting to end and for him to walk out quickly, the way people walk when they are recalculating in private, when they need space to determine what can still be salvaged. Instead, he remained in his chair after Officer Tran concluded the formal portion of the meeting, after Carol and Mr. Dow had gathered their papers and exchanged contact information, after the young administrative officer had closed the projector and quietly left the room. He sat with his hands still on the table and stared at the documents I had laid out, which Officer Tran had collected into an official evidence file but which Vincent was still looking at as if they remained in front of him. I stayed as well, not to confront him. I had said what needed to be said. The documents had said the rest, but I stayed because something in the quality of his stillness told me he was not finished, and I had spent too many years in rooms where the moment after the procedure was as important as the procedure itself to leave before I was certain the situation had reached its proper conclusion. Officer Tran remained at the head of the table, completing his documentation. It was Vincent who broke the silence. "How did you get into the safe?" He asked it without looking up. His voice was flat in a way I had not heard from him before, not the performed calm of the living room visit, not the warm attentiveness of the man who had poured my tea and promised to manage everything while I recovered. This was the voice underneath all of those voices, stripped of its purposes. I did not answer. He looked up then. "Selena," he said, not a question. I still did not answer, because it was not my answer to give, and because the confirmation he was looking for was already present in the fact that I did not deny it. Something moved across his face. A sequence of things, actually, passing in rapid succession, anger first, then the calculation of what anger would cost him in this room, then something that took me a moment to name, because I had not seen it on his face in a long time. Shame. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then it was replaced by something harder. "She had no right," he said. "Whatever she told you, she misunderstood. She didn't know the full picture." "She knew enough," I said. "She knew one side of it. She didn't know what I was trying to protect." He straightened in his chair, and I recognized the motion, the gathering of a new argument, the reaching for a different angle. He had always done this, even as a boy. When one approach failed, he did not stop. He looked for the next door. "Mom, the business was dying. Everything I built was going to disappear. I needed time. I needed resources. I was going to put the house back in your name as soon as what?" I asked. "As soon as it sold?" "The sale listing." He had not mentioned the sale listing. He had been working his way toward an explanation that did not include it. I realized, the way a person navigating a room in the dark works around the furniture they remember without acknowledging that the furniture is there. I watched him decide not to answer. "You listed it for sale," I said, "contingent on the current occupant vacating the premises." That was the plan. Not to restore my name to the certificate. To sell the house, repay the loans with part of the proceeds, and keep the remainder. I looked at him steadily. Where was I supposed to go? The question sat in the room. He did not answer it. I had not expected him to, because there was no answer that did not confirm exactly what Selena had told me in the faux shop, that he had intended to tell me I had signed the papers myself and forgotten. That the confused old woman narrative had not been improvised in my living room. It had been prepared. It had been the contingency for exactly this moment, for exactly this question. He had built a story in which I could not be believed, and he had built it out of my age, and my white hair, and my silence, and the general willingness of the world to look at a 69-year-old woman sitting quietly and conclude that quietness means absence. Officer Tran set down his pen. "Mr. Liu," he said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has been listening to everything and is now prepared to speak, "I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded as part of the formal investigation record. You have the right to have legal representation present before you say anything further. I would strongly recommend you exercise that right." Vincent looked at Officer Tran. Then he looked at me. And something happened then that I had not anticipated, which is perhaps why it struck me with the particular force that it did. His face changed. Not into anger, not into calculation, not into the performance of a reasonable man managing an unreasonable situation. It changed into something I had not seen there in so long that for a moment I could not locate it in my memory of him, and then I could. I found it in a specific afternoon 20 years ago, when Vincent was 18 and had failed an important examination and had come home and sat at the kitchen table and not said anything for a long time, and then had looked at me with the face he was wearing now. The face of a person who has run out of exits and knows it. "I didn't think you'd figure it out," he said, quietly. "Stripped of everything except the plain fact of it. I thought you were recovering. You were tired. I thought by the time you noticed, it would already be resolved. I kept telling myself it would be resolved. And Derek Pham, I said. You told yourself he would not be a problem. He said the certification suspension was temporary. That it would be reinstated within months. He said there was nothing technically wrong with the seal in the interim." Vincent's voice had taken on the specific texture of a person reciting the things they had told themselves, hearing them aloud for perhaps the first time, noting with some distant part of themselves how they sound. I knew it was wrong. I knew when I was sitting across from him and watching him press that seal that it was wrong. But the alternative was losing everything. The alternative, I said, was telling me the truth. He had nothing to say to that. I thought about the 4 seconds of shame I had seen on his face earlier. I thought about the 18-year-old at the kitchen table. I thought about what it meant to love a person through all the versions of them that exist across a lifetime, the versions that are easy to love, and the versions that require more from you than you feel you have. I thought about Kian, who had been good at this in ways I had not always been. You told me, I said, that a confused old woman couldn't expect anyone to believe her over a notarized legal document. I paused. You built that argument carefully. You wanted me to doubt myself before I started. You wanted everyone around me to doubt me. I looked at my son across the table, in the plain light of a Friday morning, with the evidence file between us and Officer Tran's recording running quietly at the head of the table. I spent 35 years in operating rooms where the difference between a correct record and an incorrect one was the difference between a patient living and dying. I was never confused about what I had signed. I was never confused about what my name looked like. I kept my voice level, unhurried, exactly the voice I used when conditions were complicated and precision was the only available option. I was simply waiting until I had everything I needed. That is not confusion. That is patience. Vincent closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked older than 38. He looked, briefly, something like the age he would be when I was gone, and this house would have passed to him through the ordinary, legal, unhurried process of time, and there would have been no need for any of this, no forged documents, no suspended notary, no sale listing, no conference room, no recording. There would only have been time, and its natural order, and a son who had simply waited for it. He had not been able to wait. I'll need you to come in for a formal statement, Officer Tran said, Monday morning, 9 o'clock, with legal representation. Vincent nodded once. He pushed back his chair and stood, and he looked at me one more time before he turned toward the door, and I looked back at him, and neither of us said anything because everything that could be said with words had been said, and the rest of it belonged to time and whatever came after. He walked out. I sat in the quiet room for a moment, listening to his footsteps in the corridor, and then to the outer door, and then to nothing. Outside the window, the Friday morning had become Friday midday without my noticing. I picked up my bag. I thanked Officer Tran. I walked out into the light, and I went home. The land use certificate arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the conference room. It came in a plain envelope from the District Housing Authority, standard government paper, the kind of envelope that contains tax notices and administrative updates, and the small bureaucratic confirmations that accumulate over a lifetime of living in one place. I opened it at the kitchen table with my tea beside me and my reading glasses on, and I read it once, and then I set it down and looked out the window at the garden for a long moment before I picked it up and read it again. Registered owner, Margaret Thi Lu. The transfer had been formally annulled. The fraudulent registration voided. The forfeiture proceedings on both loans suspended pending the criminal investigation, which Officer Tran's office had referred to the provincial prosecutor 3 days after the Friday meeting. Derek Pham had been located and taken in for questioning within the first week. The real estate agency had withdrawn the sale listing the same day the investigation became public record. The house was mine again, legally and completely, exactly as it had always been in every way that mattered. I placed the certificate on the altar table, beside the offering bowl, beneath Kian's photograph. "It's done," I said to him. Not out loud, or perhaps out loud, quietly. The way you speak in a room where you are alone, but not entirely alone. The incense I had lit that morning had burned to its midpoint, the smoke rising in its patient, unhurried line. The orchids along the back wall were doing well. The gate at the front had made its two-tone sound when the postman came through. And I had heard it from the kitchen the way I always heard it. As a known sound. A house sound. The specific voice of this specific place. I had been hearing that sound since before I could walk. The weeks after the conference room had been full of the particular kind of activity that follows when the machinery of consequence begins to move. Officer Tran called regularly with updates, careful and procedural. The bank contacted me directly to discuss the loan situation formally, apologetically, with the careful language of an institution that understands. It nearly became the instrument of its own defrauding. The real estate agency sent a written withdrawal notice and a brief letter of apology that said very little while managing to convey that they had not known the seller's ownership was in question and were very glad not to have proceeded further. I read each of these communications carefully and filed them in the folder that had grown considerably thicker since the day I had first sat at this table and sorted through my parents' land documents with a phone and a methodical intention to know exactly what I was dealing with. Selena called once, from a number I did not recognize, which told me she had changed her phone. She did not explain where she was or what she intended to do. She said only that she was sorry, and that she hoped I was well, and that she had given her formal statement to Officer Tran's office as she had agreed to do. I told her I appreciated her honesty. I told her to take care of herself. She said thank you and ended the call. And I have not heard from her since, though I think of her sometimes in the way you think of people whose circumstances you understand better than they might expect, because you are old enough to have seen the particular variety of mistake. She made the mistake of believing that loyalty to one person excuses complicity and harm to another, and old enough to know that understanding a mistake and excusing it are not the same thing. Vincent I have not spoken to. Not from anger. Anger is not what I feel when I think of my son. What I feel is more complicated than anger, and less simple than grief. It is the specific weight of loving a person across the full length of who they have been and who they became, and knowing that the distance between those two things is not something you can close by yourself. He will need to close it. Whether he does, is not mine to determine. The door of this house is not locked to him. It has never been locked to anyone who comes to it with honesty. That is a condition he knows about. He has known it since he was young enough to understand what conditions mean. I called Carol the week after the certificate arrived. We met for pho again, the same shop where I had met Selena, which had become in my mind the place where important things were said over bowls of soup that went cold while the saying happened. Carol arrived exactly on time, which she always did. We ordered and ate and talked, and at some point in the middle of it she looked at me across the table and said, "You're all right." "I am," I said. "Not just managing. Actually all right." "Yes." She nodded, satisfied, the way she nodded when a patient's chart confirmed what her observation had already told her. "Good." "That's good, Margaret." We finished our soup. We said goodbye on the pavement outside with the warmth of people who have stood on the same side of difficult things and know they will do so again if they need to. I walked home through the late morning, past the familiar sequence of shop fronts and gates and walls that constitute the view between my house and that pho shop, a view I have been looking at for 69 years in all its seasonal variations, all its small changes and persistent continuities. I thought about what I wanted to do with the house. Not in the transactional sense that Vincent had applied to the question, not as a calculation of value or a problem of management or a question of who would control it after I was gone. I thought about it in the way my parents must have thought about it in 1971, when my father mixed cement on a Saturday morning and my mother held the measuring line, and neither of them was thinking about market value or collateral or transfer documents. They were building a place for a life to happen in. That is what a house is. Not an asset, not a leverage point, not a number on a certificate. A place for a life to happen in, and then for that life to pass the place on to another life. with the understanding that this is what the house is for and has always been for. I had a niece. My sister's daughter, 26 years old, studying medicine in the city, living in a rented room that cost more than it should for what it was. A serious girl, precise in her thinking, careful with her words, with the quality of attention in her eyes that I recognized because I had seen it in the mirror for most of my life. I called my sister that evening. I would like land to have the house, I said. Not now, I'm not going anywhere. But I want it written down properly, by a legitimate notary with a current certification, witnessed by Carol and whoever else needs to witness it, with no clauses that can be removed and no provisions that depend on anyone's convenience. I paused. I want it to go to someone who will live in it, who will light incense on the altar and hear the gate in the morning and know the sound of the orchids in the wind. My sister was quiet for a moment. She will love it, she said finally. She already loves it. She told me once that she feels more like herself in your house than anywhere else she has ever been. I stood at the altar after I hung up and looked at Kian's photograph and thought about what that meant. A young woman who felt more like herself in this house than anywhere else. A house that had held one family for over 50 years and was preparing, slowly and correctly, to hold another. The certificate on the altar table caught the afternoon light and held it. I thought about the people who had tried to read my silence as absence, my stillness as weakness, my patience as confusion. I thought about what it had cost them to discover that they had been wrong. I thought about what it had cost me to let them discover it in the only way that would actually reach them, not through argument, not through pleading, not through the raised voice of a woman demanding to be heard, but through the precise and irrefutable language of documents laid on a table in the correct order at the correct time. Still water runs deepest, not because it is passive, not because it accepts what falls into it without response, but because it moves without announcing itself, reaches without reaching visibly, arrives at its destination without the noise that would have allowed anyone to prepare for its coming. I had spent 69 years becoming still water, and in the end, the surface had not needed to break for the depth to show. If anyone has ever looked at you and seen only your age, only your silence, only what they thought you had already given, this story is for you. Growing older does not mean growing smaller. The ones who underestimate you are not seeing clearly. They are simply not yet aware of what you have been quietly building all along. If Margaret's story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. There are more stories like this one, and every single person in them deserves to be heard. We'd love to know, did you think Margaret was right to give Vincent a chance to come forward on his own before she acted, or would you have moved sooner?